Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. My name is James Vellan, and today I'm going to be talking about mixed methods approaches to usability testing based on my own experiences working at Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. So just to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to start with a very brief description about what qualitative and quantitative data is and some distinctions between the two. I'm then going to talk about which type of data you might want to choose based upon your specific research questions and projects, and when it might be beneficial for you to actually combine them, which is what's going to be the focus of this talk today. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the resource requirements that you might want to consider using mixed methods approaches, as well as how to actually measure data, qualitative and quantitative data. Finally, I'm going to talk very briefly about developing measures of your own in the context of quantitative data, drawing conclusions under a mixed methods framework, and then just provide you a brief summary of the presentation as a whole. So to start, what is qualitative and quantitative data? So qualitative data, as you might be familiar with, is that data which is non-numerical and is data that you can't inherently categorize or measure. And this is data that you might obtain via interviews, open-ended questionnaires, that sort of thing. And in essence, it's something that you can't, as I mentioned, you can inherently categorize it or quantify it, and this requires some form of resource-intensive analyzing of the data, sitting down and familiarizing yourself with it. Quantitative data, on the other hand, is numerical data that you can obtain in a variety of ways, such as via Likert scales, those 1 to 7, strongly disagree to strongly agree sort of scales. You might be interested in something such as time on task, so how long users actually take to complete a specific task within your product. You might also look at the frequency of an event of interest. So how often do users perform a particular thing in the context of using your product? So based on this, qualitative and quantitative data may seem inherently at odds with each other. They're not easily combinable. They're not easily analyzed in the same methods. And typically qualitative data is often seen as being less than quantitative data in the sense that it's less definitive and less serious. But despite this, I think that combining both methods can lead to a richer understanding and conclusions for both usability testing and user experience as a whole. So the question of which method to choose, qualitative versus quantitative, or when mixing methods, I think depends largely on two things. The first of which is your research question. So how you frame your research question might inherently favor you towards choosing one method over another, or to combining both of them. And to a lesser extent, I think it also depends on your project design. So how you've designed your particular research project and what exactly you're looking to get out of your research project will affect which methods you might favor and allow for the opportunity to combine methods. So when it comes to choosing based on your research question, you might find that quantitative approaches are ideal for testing specific predictions and answering specific hypotheses. So for example, you might ask yourself, is there a difference in performance between these two groups? So when they're using your product, are they using it in the same way? Are they getting to the answer in maybe the same time? Are they performing the same sorts of errors? Something to that effect. You might also be interested in specific variables that predict task success. Perhaps you already have an idea about the types of things that make using your particular product difficult for some users. So then you can design manipulations for these variables to see to what extent they actually influence successful use of the product. So in contrast, qualitative approaches are ideal for answering broad questions and obtaining very nuanced answers. So for example, you might ask, why do users find this particular feature to be frustrating? And you might be asking this question perhaps because you don't necessarily have a good idea at the beginning of a research project what sort of factors are making a particular feature to be frustrating. Or perhaps you do, and you're trying to get much more nuanced answers and a richer understanding. And the important thing I want to mention here is that these two sorts of data aren't mutually exclusive and can in fact feed into one another. So the results you obtain and the conclusions you draw from analyzing one particular stream of data can feed into and inform research questions for using a different stream, which is why combining methods can be beneficial. When it comes to choosing based on project design, you might find, as I mentioned previously, that some project goals are far more conducive to one methodology over another, or to combining both methods. So as I mentioned, qualitative and quantitative data can feed into one another. So by starting off very broadly, say, with a qualitative analysis based on interview data, you can then develop specific predictions and research questions that are very conducive to quantitative approaches. And then alternatively, results that you obtain from quantitative analyses can perhaps force you to go broader and investigate certain questions from a qualitative angle. You might also find that sometimes particular participant behaviors and responses might differ depending on the type of approach you might want to adopt. So for instance, at IRCC, we're in the process of testing an unconscious bias tip sheet, which is designed to make management aware of unconscious bias when it comes to workplace interactions and hiring decisions. Now, unconscious bias, as you might imagine, is something that many people would consider to be a very sensitive topic. So in order to avoid things such as socially desirable responding and having participants guess what the demands of the particular test are, we thought that approaching it from a quantitative angle and getting participants to respond in the form of scales might eliminate some of the bias and some of the pressure to respond in a certain way based on being interviewed in the context of a usability test, as qualitative testing would have them do. So when it comes to combining the methods, as I've stressed before, it may be beneficial to employ both methods to investigate a problem. So as an example, users might find it difficult to interact with a particular section of a website. So you might develop research questions that will tackle both very broad topics in order to get more information, and then develop specific quantitative hypotheses and test them that way. So an example of this, you might ask yourself, what, according to users, makes this site difficult to use? This question would certainly be very conducive to a qualitative approach. And then from there, once you've accumulated a bit of information, you then might ask yourself, how do these certain aspects of the site affect its successful use? So by developing specific hypotheses and testing them, you get both the what and then the data to back it up. As you might imagine, there's both pros and cons to combining qualitative and quantitative methods into a mixed methods approach. One major pro is that it allows for a more complete understanding of the problem. As well, you can refine the approach for one method based on the insights of another. It's very much iterative and conducive to very long projects where you're trying to establish a thorough understanding of the problem. A con, however, is that it is more resource intensive. In the context of qualitative analyses, the resource cost comes from the sheer number of participants you need to collect data from, and more participants can be very much quite demanding on your recruitment strategies. However, cons for recruitment with qualitative data is that you will spend more resources analyzing the data and actually conducting interviews, let's say. As well, you may require at least some stats knowledge for quantitative data analysis. Some analysis may be very basic, but other analysis can be very complex. It might require statistical knowledge that you might not necessarily be familiar with. Resources, as I mentioned, depend very much so on the approach and your specific resource and your specific research question. Quantitative approaches might demand several dozen to several hundreds of participants. That depends on the analysis and the type of statistics you need to run. Statistics, you need to consider the underlying assumptions that make these tests valid and reliable. And if you don't meet those assumptions, then it might not be in your best interest to actually conduct that test. However, qualitative analyses will require a lot less resources in terms of participants, but will counter that by requiring more resources in terms of time to conduct the interviews and to analyze the data later on. In terms of participant sample size, you might elect to employ a small predefined sample size, or you might elect to employ what's called theoretical sampling. So theoretical sampling here is when you use insights that you would gain from earlier sessions to inform later sessions in sampling. So say, for instance, a participant in one session raises something that you haven't previously observed in previous sessions. It's a new insight for you and the team. You might sample participants who have specifically encountered that problem or have that specific experience in order to flesh out your understanding of what exactly that experience is, get a more complete understanding of that experience. And you would typically do this until theoretical saturation is reached. So theoretical saturation is the point at which you're no longer getting new insights from your participants, and your understanding is as complete as it's going to be for that specific research question. So estimates vary as to when exactly theoretical saturation would be reached. Some of the more liberal estimates would place this at anywhere from 6 to 12 participants, but some of the more conservative estimates might say you need as many as 30 participants. More realistically, your research problem and research question will fall somewhere in between the two. So when it comes to actually measuring data itself, qualitative methods, you're really coding data based on emerging themes, and there's several theoretical lenses in which you might choose to adopt analyzing this data, but ultimately it comes down to sitting down with the data, reading through it, excuse me, and familiarizing yourself with the data and coding it accordingly. Really, you're letting your data guide you. And depending on your particular theoretical lens and project demands, you might be as objective or as subjective as you want when it comes to actually analyzing your data. Quantitative methods, however, will typically involve one or more statistical analyses based on the type of data you have, and very much try to be as objective as possible. Now, to that end, I would recommend that you want to plan out your analyses in advance based on the type of data that you know you'll be collecting and your specific research question. Really here, what you want to look for when you're planning is you want to determine what you want to measure and how you want to measure it. Doing so will not only give you a good idea of what your data will look like and how you're actually going to measure it based on the assumptions you have about the data. But if your data don't actually meet your assumptions, then you'll have a backup plan in place to analyze your data based on how the assumptions are violated and based on the type of data that you actually do have. So when it comes to developing measures in the context of Likert scales, let's say, for most applications, it's typically better to use an existing measure. Reason being is that, first off, this measure has been developed with a specific application in mind. If you have a scale that's measuring usability, let's say, typically scales that are out there and available have been validated with thousands of participants beforehand, and they measure according to how they've been developed and are valid in that respect. And so if your use case matches up with the application that's been developed for, it's very easy to quickly use it and know you're getting valid and reliable results. If, however, you have an application where you would benefit from a purpose-built measure in your own work, as I attempt to do at IRCC, here are some considerations that I would recommend when it comes to actually developing measures for yourself. So the first thing you would want to consider is the applications for the measure. So how the measure is going to be used, when it's going to be used, and what sort of things you're looking to get out of it. You want to collaborate with colleagues during the development of the measure. Not only will this help you define what you're trying to measure as completely as possible, but it'll also get your colleagues on board with what the measure is actually measuring. You'll want to use this measure for a while, presumably because it's a big investment to develop a measure. And so with that in mind, you want to make sure that the whole team is on board with it. And as I mentioned, you'll also just want to capture as much of the construct you're trying to measure as possible. Get a complete definition, or as complete of a definition of what you're trying to measure as you can. And then from there, develop questions that capture as much of that definition as possible. Other considerations for developing a measure are the sample size that you would need for validation. Often this includes several hundred participants completing the measure, which might be realistic and easily doable for some employers, but for others it might not necessarily be that easy. As well, you might want to control for overall length of the measure. So a 60-item questionnaire would certainly provide a complete measure of the construct that you're actually trying to measure, but it might not be realistic for a lot of people to want to complete in a length of time that you give them. In an online application, it's a lot easier for someone to simply close their browser window rather than sit through a half-hour questionnaire. Now, when it comes to drawing conclusions in mixed methods approaches, you should consider both data streams in relation to both the overall research question and in relation to each other. Mixed methods approaches and reporting data more generally is really boils down to telling a story about your data, contextualizing the results and what they mean. And so you should not only do that for both of your data streams, but in relation to each of the data streams. So how are they the same? How do they support each other? As well as how do they differ from each other? As well, you want to give your data streams equal weight. And what I mean by that is you want to consider both data streams as being, equally valid and treat them as such. There's a tendency, certainly in psychology, but elsewhere as well, that qualitative data is less than quantitative data. And I'm of the opinion that that's simply not true. And employing a mixed methods approach, I believe you have to treat it that way as well, that your data, both qualitative and quantitative, is equally valid and coming from your participants in an equally valid way. And so you should treat it as such. So just in summary, mixed methods approaches have the potential to generate far greater insights than either qualitative and quantitative methods alone. And they give a more complete understanding of the problem and research question at hand. However, they do so at the expense of greater resource and knowledge requirements. However, if your project can accommodate mixed methods approaches, consider incorporating them because generally speaking, they can do nothing but good for a given project. So I'd like to thank NSERC, the CLUE program, and IRCC for having me as their internship student. And thank you for listening.